So I'd like to introduce the second speaker on stage, Edward Everson, who is head of growth for F2Pool, please, on stage. And he will talk about mining Ethereum in 2019.
Hello, everyone. Can't see any of you because the lights are right here. But yeah, so today I'll be speaking about Ethereum mining in 2019. Name's Edward Evenson, as she said, represent F2Pool. And during this presentation, I hope to kind of reveal some of the opaque industry that is mining and help you all understand a little bit more about Ethereum mining. More specifically, some of the contents of this speech will revolve around prog POW, GPUs and ASICs, whether all this is still relevant with proof of stake on the horizon, and some key takeaways, things to consider for Ethereum mining in 2019. So let's start off with prog POW. I'm sure some of you will be familiar with prog POW already, but in order to understand prog POW and why it's such a hot topic right now, it's really important to look at the rise of Ethereum ASICs. So in July of 2018, Bitmain releases the Antminer E3, and this is one of the first big ASICs for the Ethereum network and ETH hash algorithm. And several months later, Silicon releases the ETHmaster A10 in September of 2018. These are about 2 to 3 times more efficient than the regular commodity GPU miners use. And so there wasn't too much concern as far as ASICs completely dominating the network, as well as that they're relatively new. However, then Linger, another ASIC manufacturer, released the announcement of a chip that would be 7 times more efficient at the ETH hash algorithm than these two ASICs, and this started to raise some alarm bells. It started raising questions of Ethereum mining and whether it would start to look like Bitcoin's network and mining. Bitmain, late 2017, early 2018, had basically 75% of the market share. And so they started asking themselves, do we really want the Ethereum network to resemble that of Bitcoin's in terms of mining? So now that we understand that, let's go over a little bit of the basics of what prog POW actually is. It stands for programmatic proof of work, and basically it's an attempt to optimize GPU mining in a way that destroys the economic incentives to use ASICs to mine Ethereum. This does it in a number of key ways. One of the first ways is the KKAK hashes are at the beginning and end of the ETH hash algorithm are reduced from F1600 to F800 and a word size of 64 to 32. Basically what this means is that there's much less instructions that a GPU has to execute when mining the ETH hash algorithm, and they have native 32-bit data paths, so it just makes it much more efficient for them. There are also KISS-99 calculations added to the fill mix stage. And while this only takes about 5% of the entire computation for the ETH hash algorithm in programmatic proof of work, basically you would need to install an accelerator on the ASIC chip, which could be a very costly process, and it doesn't really add too much efficiency to do so. So that's another reason why the economic incentive of an Ethereum ASIC would be attacked. And then there's many other small details and switches, but that basically amount to upping the computational utilization of a GPU to match that of its memory or storage utilization, just making GPUs that much more efficient. So basically, if an ASIC were to implement or change its hardware to accommodate prog POW, it would start to very closely resemble a GPU, and at that point, why invest in the R&D, all the extra costs, if you could just go buy a commodity GPU and it's almost as efficient. So now that we have a short summary of prog POW, let's get into GPUs and ASICs in the mining industry. Go over some pros and cons of each. GPU mining, you can mine multiple currencies and switch pretty quickly between the two, or any currency you want to mine. This has been shown with Grin recently. Many GPU miners have switched over to Grin because it's pretty profitable for them to do so. It can be repurposed for alternate use, used for AI, machine learning, graphics renderings, gaming, things like that. And because of these various different industries that you can use GPUs for, there's an excellent gray market. You can resell them for a lot of value still. They use standard hardware, easy to support, reliable. People are familiar with them across the globe, and they are upgradable. Some of the downsides, however, for the amount of hash they output, they consume a considerable amount of power. They can't compete with ASICs on the same network. They're not competitive, so this means they basically can't be used to mine some of the most popular cryptocurrencies to mine, such as Bitcoin, Litecoin, Decred, for example. And for the amount of hash they output, they're relatively large. So when we think of the amount of space they take up in these large mining warehouses and how efficient the use of space is, it's not that high. ASICs, on the other hand, have extremely efficient power usage in terms of hashes per watt output. They have a large amount of hash power straight out of the box. So in the current iterations from, say, Bitmain, WhatsMiner, you can have an ASIC miner on the Bitcoin network, say, that'll have 60 to 70 terahashes per second, which is an order of magnitude above those present on the ETH network. They're compact for the amount of hash they have, so they can fill warehouses quite efficiently, and you can quickly recover the cost given a certain electricity, meaning that you can invest in a large farm or a smaller operation and cover the cost currently in about, given about a 3% kilowatt hour electricity rate, maybe 6 to 12 months. However, they're very limited in supply. Speaking with some of these ASIC manufacturers, all the orders are sold out really before the announcement because it's extremely costly to put in these orders at the ASIC chip manufacturers, so they need to make sure that they have a sufficient number of customers before they do so. So you may have to wait 4, 5 months after the announcement date if you don't have one of these personal relationships to get your hands on some. Many, not all, the S9 being a good example from Bitmain, are obsolete upon the release of the next iteration of an ASIC. So basically, you could have a mining equipment in the form of an ASIC, and then when the new model comes out, you lose like 90% of the value of your machine, and it's not really that competitive against the new ones. So they have a short lifespan and a low resale value upon that happening. There's also a pretty high cost of entry. It takes a lot of startup capital for someone to open up an ASIC mining operation. So high barrier of entry, and there's limited coin selection because ASICs can only be really tailored for one algorithm. And if you want to get into ASIC mining, most popular ones, Bitcoin, Decred, Litecoin, and possibly soon Ethereum. One other thing for a con I would add, compared to GPUs to this list, is that ASIC manufacturers are highly concentrated in China, and they're all privately owned. Whereas GPU distributors and manufacturers, say AMD and NVIDIA, are publicly traded companies, and therefore answerable to shareholders and have an immense amount of pressure to continue to pump out useful products for the public at large, whereas some of these private ASIC manufacturers can simply decide not to sell their rigs to the public and mine themselves. So now that we know a little bit about Prog POW, ASIC versus GPU mining, is any of this still relevant with proof of stake so close on the horizon? I think we can handle this one fairly quickly. Well, even though, pure proof of stake, Casper CBC, it's not necessarily coming next month or anytime in the very near future, mining is still going to be extremely relevant on the Ethereum network as far as providing security for that network. And there's many reasons why mining is still relevant. Originally with Casper Hybrid, the staked coins will be held on the proof of work chain. The hybrid model will exist for some years before pure proof of stake is implemented. Mining is not going anywhere, and if we care about the security of the Ethereum network, then we still care about mining. So, things to consider, the best cases for Prog POW, maybe the best cases against Prog POW, and some key takeaways from all of this. Some best cases for Prog POW. Since its nascency, Ethereum has really advocated to be ASIC resistant. You can see this in its yellow paper. You can see this on its website of the Ethereum Foundation. From a very early stage, they've stated that they don't want to resemble Bitcoin's mining network, and with what's happened to it with the introduction of ASICs. We have the history of the Bitcoin hash wars in recent memory. In the summer of 2017, we have the contentious hard fork of Bitcoin Cash, and more recently in fall of last year, we have the very, very public hash war between Bitcoin Cash ABC and Bitcoin Cash SV. Some of you may remember drunken interviews, people waving watches around, saying they'd be willing to sell them all to protect the network and win the hash war. Also, Ethereum ASICs are fairly new to the market. The main ones just came out last year. So this means that theoretically they haven't had much market penetration yet. So sort of forking them out of the algorithm could potentially not pose that much of a threat to the security of the Ethereum network like it would the Bitcoin one. Few software upgrades are required of mining pools, mining farms, if we do implement programmatic proof of work, so there's not much of a burden on them to change. And it combats the centralization brought to mining by the widespread proliferation of ASICs. A good example of this centralization, Bitmain recently announced that it's going to deploy about $80 million worth of its mining equipment this season to mine Bitcoin. And this kind of puts into perspective the viability for new competitors to enter that space when a monolith that produces these ASICs can say that they're going to put nearly $100 million into mining it themselves. And this is another excellent example of how sometimes ASIC manufacturers compete directly with consumers of their product. So, some excellent cases for Prog POW. I would also add that should proliferation of ASICs reach sort of a critical mass, there's also a risk that maybe miners, when it comes time to implement proof of stake, just continue to mine the old chain because it's profitable for them, and they don't necessarily support the transition. So the best case is against it now. We don't have the exact sales figures for Bitmain and InnoSilicon that sell these ASICs for Ethereum mining, so it does present somewhat of a gamble to remove them from the ETH hash algorithm. We don't know how much this would decrease the hash specifically and how much more risk it would provide to the Ethereum network, so how much it would widen the attack surface on the Ethereum network. I would also add that programmatic proof of work is a more difficult hashing algorithm, and that means less hashes per second. And while that's not necessarily the best metric to gauge network security, that coupled with decreasing miner participation could drastically widen the attack surface in a crucial time before this transition to proof of stake and Casper. Furthermore, with Casper on the horizon, GPU miners are starting to question the viability of mining Ethereum still. There isn't going to be as many rewards for them in the future. This can be reflected in how many have switched to more profitable ventures like mining Beam or Grin in recent months. As we can see from the data, this is taken from Digital Asset Research. So also there's been a decrease in block rewards several times. So with decreasing block rewards, more profitable ventures like mining Grin or Beam and taking out ASICs from the network all kind of contribute to drastically reducing the hash in conjunction with one another. So this could be somewhat dangerous for the Ethereum network. So what are some of the key figures? What are some of the big players saying about all this? What are their opinions? If you look at progpowcarbonvote.com, you can see some people that are voicing their opinions on all this. There's been about 2.9 million Ether staked in favor of Prog POW. I will note that this is mostly pools and some miners. This isn't necessarily everyone weighing in on the issue, but it's still pretty shocking that 94% are dramatically in favor of this. Some voices against it. Obviously, Linger, who announced the new crazy powerful ASIC, they've obviously invested a ton of money into R&D and are trying to sell a product, so it's pretty clear why they would protest loudly something like this. Also, some funds have recently come out in some pretty public articles on CoinDesk and other mediums stating why they think Prog POW is a bad idea. One of which is that ASICs aren't the reason for centralization of mining. It's really electricity cost. I would personally butt back against this because most mining happens in China and they don't have the cheapest electricity in the world. If it was all about the cheapest electricity, all mining would be happening in Central Asia, Kazakhstan, Iran, some Latin American countries, which isn't the case. And also, they say that instead of putting so much time into try to basically making a new ETH hash algorithm, we should instead be putting our efforts towards disincentivizing mining pools and large mining farms from becoming attackers of the network and make sure that they are cooperating with developers as opposed to constantly in combat with them. Also, just full transparency, F2Pool, who I represent, voted in favor of Prog POW. We've listened to our clients and the various miners we work with. They seem to be in support of this. And on top of this, we think it's important that those miners that aren't necessarily part of this massive network, that don't have access to all these ASICs, also be able to participate in securing the network. I've met several at this conference, actually, who have managed to pull together some resources with some other miners, be viable, participate in securing the Ethereum network, and they've been involved in the development of Ethereum for some years now, so it's probably fair that they get a chance to play a part in securing the network. I couldn't go over all the topics as in-depth as I wanted, so I encourage anyone that has further questions or that was intrigued by any one of these topics to come talk to me or any one of us up at the booth or right outside the doors up there. Thank you for your time, and yeah, well, no matter what happens, we'll continue supporting the Ethereum network, whether it's implemented or not.
Edward, so before you go, I just wanted to quickly ask you two questions. You mentioned something really interesting. So I know you're originally from California, but now you live full-time in Beijing. So could you comment on where exactly is mining congregated in certain areas of China, and if so, why?
Yeah, so one of the reasons why I mentioned earlier Bitmain and them deploying about $80 million worth of hardware. The reason why this is happening is that there's something called the wet season in Sichuan, which is a province in southwestern China near the Tibetan Plateau. And basically, in the spring and summer, lots of snow melts off the mountains, tons of water comes through, there's a lot of hydro plants over there, and this means very cheap electricity in the region. And during this time, I believe it was Frost and Sullivan, their report, but about like 49.5% of Bitcoin mining comes from this region during that time. And everyone gets really excited for it. Cheap electricity, mining happens all the time. And also northern China, so northwestern, we have Gansu and Xinjiang that are very popular. And it's also just interesting to think about, we're on the cutting edge of all this technology, but we're still so reliant on these natural phenomena. Like, we're waiting for water to come down from the mountains to mine these cryptocurrencies. But yeah, those parts of China.
That's very interesting. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.